So thanks everyone for being here. I really appreciate you being willing to participate in this conversation among experts in the city that are working on homelessness together and our houselessness. Yeah, so let's start with, because the people who may watch this conversation one day don't necessarily know who the people in this conversation are. So if you could just take a minute and introduce yourselves and say what you do and maybe a little something about how you coordinate with the other people who are here. And anyone can start.
Hi, I'm Kevin McDonnell and I'm on the City Council. I've lived in Petaluma for nearly 40 years and I am the council's appointment to the Continuum of Care Board. That's the HUD mandated regional homelessness solution board.
And how do you, Kevin, how do you interact with the other people who are here?
Well, obviously, each of us has a distinct role in this, and PPSC is the city's services provider, and ace up our sleeve for all troubles, all our and an awful lot of our social troubles, and a bit of funding through PPSC. And so Elece and I interface, and the city and PPSC interface quite a bit. And in regards to the unhoused issues in town, the police are one of our teammates to have right there front and center with every activity. And I've known Chuck for a while as a longtime supporter of COTS back from the John Records day, and really respect the work that COTS does, being the service provider in Petaluma.
Okay, thanks. Who wants to go next?
I can go next. Hi, Lil. I'm Chuck Fernandez. I'm the CEO with COTS. And how we interact with one another, a couple ways. One, Kevin and I, as he said, are both on the Continuum of Care HUD mandated, and that's the county's system of care for addressing homelessness. Elece and I also meet every 2 weeks. We just have a conversation about what's going on in our organizations and how we can work together more effectively. COTS, the Petaluma Police Department, the Downtown Streets team, Petaluma Health Center, Friends of the River, we get together every Monday at 1 o'clock on Zoom to talk about what's going on with the unsheltered in the community. What are some of the hot spots? Where do we need to address? Or there's things that we need to maybe bring some clients into the shelter. So we meet every Monday and address situations.
Great, thanks, Chuck.
And then I'm Brian Miller. I'm our Deputy Chief of Police. I appreciate the opportunity to represent the chief here today, and the police department's been involved with PCRC for a number of years, and so we appreciate the continued collaboration there. Lifelong resident Sonoma County, been a Petaluma resident for 16 years, worked at the Petaluma Police Department for 16 years, so happy to have that continued commitment to our community as well. And then, like the others have said, there's a lot of overlap. I've worked with Elece for a number of years, but we've been a partner with PPSC and Mentor Me and a number of their programs, and had a lot of overlap and continue to work together on a number of issues affecting their clients, and same with COTS. Like Chuck was saying, our staff's regularly meeting with both of those organizations regularly. In addition to shelterless individuals, our staff, we have a lieutenant assigned over community health outreach, which encompasses serial inebriates, mental health issues, and shelterless communities. And as a number of people are probably going to be watching and familiar, and I know Councilmember McDonnell's familiar, we've been working with PPSC and a number of other organizations throughout the county as we're working to develop a mobile crisis intervention team. So like Elece said, I'm meeting with her weekly. We've probably never talked so much as we've talked recently about that program, and we're getting really close to implementing and standing that up here in the near future. And then, like Chuck said, my staff's meeting weekly with his team, and we've been doing that for a number of years since we had the host team and the Sober Circle pilot program. And then independently of both of those, for years dating back to officers Esponda and our SRO program and Officer Bill Baseman. We've been working with County Mental Health and Buckaloo and a number of other organizations throughout the community for individuals that are challenged with mental health crises. So longstanding relationships, and appreciate being at the table today.
Thanks, Brian. Elise?
So I'm Elece Hempel. I'm the Executive Director of Petaluma People Services Center, and actually have the honor and pleasure to work with our community and everybody on this call every day to provide programs that strengthen the independence and self-sufficiency of the individuals in our community. But on the housing side, most of PPSC's programs are prevention and intervention. So we're charged with getting people into housing, keeping people housed so they don't fall into the unsheltered model. And so a lot of the work that we do is as upstream, trying to keep people housed so that they're not necessarily needing those additional programs. But we also run the largest community clinic in Sonoma County for those who need mental health services. And so we touch that population in a lot of different ways. And I'm excited to have this conversation so that our residents can really understand how we work together, where the touch points are, because I don't think a lot of people understand those touch points. And with that takes me to the first question that I really want to ask is oftentimes the community thinks that the shelter is funded by the city, and they don't really understand the whole funding mechanism and how we provide the services. And I'm wondering if Chuck and Kevin can kind of talk about how the funding formula comes together to provide these services to our residents.
Well, I'd definitely let Chuck speak to the funding of the Mary Isaac Center and the COTS programs there. But people have to realize that this is a national crisis, and it has state attention in it, and so there's funding coming down from the outside and organizations to help get that money into our community. And there's millions and millions being spent every year in Sonoma County on this issue already through the many good providers around the county. Chuck, you want to talk about COTS's balance?
Yeah, so at COTS, if you think of all of our programs for the unsheltered, our budget is about $6 million, and about 22% of that, or a little over 1.2 million, is from the government. We also get funding from private foundations, and it's about 28% of our funding. I think if you look at the typical donations and contributions from the community members, that's almost 30% of the funding that we receive to help all of our programs and services within Mary Isaac. So yeah, that's some of our funding. And to elaborate a little bit more on what Kevin said, we rely on federal funding, state funding, county funding, and funding from the city of Petaluma as well to support our programs for the unsheltered and sheltered.
So the city
jump in on that too.
Just to say that the city funds several parts of several programs and is increasing its funding in this area. The most recent addition being the Downtown Streets team, which is hundreds of thousands of dollars, and part of what Measure U has helped funding us in greater response next year is to increase that. And when we talk about the path away from homelessness, we'll get into what each piece requires, what each step of a path away from homelessness requires. But DST, Downtown Streets team, is a great outreach element we've stood up. And then also, as Officer Miller was saying, the CAHOOTS style program that Petaluma is putting up is a considerable amount of money, and a lot of it is in connection with contact with unsheltered persons. So the city's own general fund is directly funding many programs.
I think I live in the world of understanding where funding comes and how you have to do it. And I also live in the world of understanding that with every penny of funding you get, whether it be from the federal government or even a foundation, it comes with limitations. And I think it's important for the community to understand some of the limitations that Chuck and his team at COTS have to kind of work around in order to meet the demands from especially the federal and state funding gods, if you will.
So Lou, if I could add just one comment to what Elise and Kevin said, the city is putting a lot of money into the unsheltered. I mean, they're investing a lot of money, much more than they've ever done. And so it's important for all of us, Kevin, Brian, Elise, to really work together so that we're all communicating, we're all understanding what's going on. We all can address program or issues a lot quicker. The other thing is we want to make sure that there's some return on your investment, right? If we're investing all this money, what are we getting for that? And what impact are we having on the homeless? Are we getting them into homes? Are we getting them into services and programs? Are we getting them off the streets? And so all of that becomes important as well.
Yeah, and
you just tapped on a real important part, programs. I mean, programs are the key to getting people housed. I mean, housing is important, but they have to have a program that can help them with all their needs to sustain being housed. And one of the things we haven't mentioned is that countywide, we voted for a mental health tax as Measure O in the last cycle. And we're trying to make sure that some of that money comes down to Petaluma for mental health services. Mental health services make programs run and programs get people in houses.
Yeah, so I wanted to follow up on this. So I'm curious to hear you have a discussion amongst you about what things do you think are working really well in the programs and the coordination that are going to the unhoused that you all are doing. What do you think is working really well right now?
I can add one, and then I know Elise and probably Brian or Kevin. I think one thing that's working well is street outreach. How we get into the community, how we connect with people that are living in tents by the rivers. That process takes a lot of time. Typically, they're not very trusting people. And so, you know, you have to follow up. If you say you're going to be there tomorrow, you need to show up tomorrow. And it just takes a long time. I think when you add the downtown streets team into that mix, I think that's working well. I'll let my colleagues jump in.
Okay. Yeah, from Brian's or Elise's perspective, what do you think is working really well?
Yeah, and I would echo what Chuck said. I mean, the most telling thing is we've been working with a consultant as we're building out this mobile crisis team, and it's really nice to hear when you have an outside perspective kind of coming in and doing this assessment and looking at our community and our issues and what resources that we do have available and the coordination that we're doing. And we're getting some complimentary feedback. He was very impressed with the level of service that we're offering the community and the commitments and investments that we've been making. And I think that the one thing when we've been navigating all these discussions is we can point back to a lot of different programs and milestones over a number of years where we've looked at these issues, we've proactively tried to implement things, and we've tried a number of different programs, and some have worked and some haven't. And then some things, because of issues and fundings and just shifts in a number of issues, we've you know, at least from the police department, we've had staffing issues that have contributed to us not being able to maintain certain services. And so when we look back at what some of the programs that were successful, we really recognize how important they were, and we need to make those commitments getting back. And so we've gotten those commitments from council and from the Measure U and the community on trying to work to build back some of our emergency resources and those commitments. And so we look forward to bringing back higher level of service. And then the coordination, like we've touched on a number of times, it's just something that is unique here. And a lot of other jurisdictions and communities are having to create these programs in these organizations from scratch. And so we've got great partners, great history of working relationships, and we're seeing those impacts here locally. And my staff really talks of when we are successful, when a program's successful, it's not every time, but when we are, the impacts and the carryover from those successes is huge. And they're really, really beneficial. And we see from a police response perspective, it alleviates a lot of our response. One individual may create a lot of challenges for each of our entities, but when we can help get them into housing or get them into treatment or get them into counseling services, and it improves their condition, it's immensely helpful to them and to the community, and improves that quality of life for everyone. So
Thanks, Brian.
And I have to agree. It's in part, it's this strong collaboration. I always call it the island of Petaluma. You know, we all have to figure out how to get along and how to work together so that we don't get voted off this wonderful island. And we see that collaboration all the time, whether it be staff to staff, peer to peer, or even outside agency to another agency. You know, those kinds of communications are really, really strong. Can we do better? Of course. We can always learn from mistakes. I think one of the things that both COTS and PPSC do really, really well is we communicate with our clients. How can we do this better? How can we move you along the path faster? Or if you're going to choose to be unhoused and want to live in a way that I don't traditionally think somebody should have to live, but that's your choice, how can we support you in doing that? And I think we really do a good job with that. And I believe that, again, it takes a whole group of us. And so, kind of figuring out how we touch base. I am excited. I think one of the things that we've done really, really well, especially with the police department, is our Sober Circle program, which will then be rolled into our SAFE program, which is part of the CAHOOTS model programming. But I also think that the diversion programs that we run through our youth programming actually get to the root of the problem with young people before they actually lose their ability to get stable housing or are dropouts and not able to get their GED. I think those kinds of upstream programs help us down the road immensely. And it's really hard to put a number or gauge the outcomes. What happens to a young person who is stopped by the police department and instead of getting an arrest is given to the diversion program and getting the services that they need. It's hard to put on a number or a value on if that young person would have been arrested and gotten into the juvenile probation system and then, offended again. I mean, those kinds of dollars, you can't really put your hand around, but those are the things that are really working well in our community.
Okay,
So if I could add one more thing.
sure.
You think about what's working well. We talked about collaboration, everything. At the root of all of that is leadership. I think when you think about leadership from City Manager Peggy Flynn, when you think about leadership from Mayor Barrett, when you think about leadership from Chief Savano, I think what makes Petaluma so unique is we've got strong leadership. They're visionary. They're not afraid to try something new. They take action and they just work well together with everybody. They inspire you to want to do more. And so I really think what makes Petaluma unique, and sort of building on what Brian and Elece said, was we've got terrific leadership, and that makes a difference. We all know that.
Chuck, you talked about impact, wanting to have impact. I'm curious if it's you or who in the group would have some kind of numbers on what is the current state with houselessness and what is the trend? What trend are we on? Does someone know that?
Well, you can just start by saying that every year, every other year we're required, but in Sonoma County every year we try and have a point in time count to identify who the unsheltered are. And one of the things I like about that work is that they interview many of the unsheltered people that they're counting. But we know that the number, the last one we did was 2020, and COVID caused us to miss a year, but we'll be doing this again. And so perhaps COVID actually impacted our numbers and accelerate from the last data point. But the last data point was about 2,700, I believe, in the countywide number, with about 300 in Petaluma. And Petaluma's numbers pretty constant over a couple of years prior to that. But it's interesting, countywide, there was a big funding push to help the transitional aged youth cohort. Many of the personal situations of your life become known as cohorts. So transitional age youth is those coming out of foster care and becoming adults and not having systems in place. But with strong funding, that group dropped 50% in one year. And it's ideas like that that make us think we can get to functional zero if we could identify the right thing for the right cohort.
Anyone have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I wanted to make sure that, I mean, Kevin's correct. All those numbers that he mentioned was accurate. I also want to make sure that if we talk about numbers, that we don't forget about equity. If you look at the 2020 point in time count, 64% of the people that were counted, at least estimated, were white. 36% of the remaining people were either multi-race, Black or African American, Pacific Islander, Indian, American Indian, et cetera. And so I think it's important that we mention equity. We mention that whatever we do, we address not only race, but other marginalized populations, whether they be LGBTQ, our senior populations are increasing, those with mental health challenges. So I think all of that is really critical. Elise, it looks like, did you want to jump in?
No, I agree, Chuck. And I think, you know, to Kevin's point is pinpointing what the needs are and how we're going to address them. I think we're going to find in our SAFE team, it's not just for those who are unsheltered, it's for those who may be at risk of losing their existing home. And by having a community-based organization actually being the boots on the ground, if you will, and making those interactions and connections, we're actually able to then schedule, and we just are building this out with our scheduling program, but we'll be able to schedule an appointment with somebody that may not be having a mental health break at that point, but says, you know, I'd like to have an appointment with the therapist. Our team will be actually able to schedule that appointment through our online scheduling system, so that individual can get counseling within 5 days of that contact with that SAFE team. And so I think it's again looking at where the biggest needs are and how we're going to address it. And to Chuck's point, I am concerned. One of my biggest concerns that we have to figure out a solution for is that, especially in Petaluma, the number of us who are turning 65 and older in the next 5 years is huge. I mean, it's almost tenfold. I mean, I remember standing up in front of the city council 18 years ago saying, you know, in 2020, we're going to have so many seniors living in our community. How are we going to address their needs? And we are at that point. And I had a conversation yesterday with a senior who is currently living in her car. And what she said is, she's pretty self-sufficient. She has a job. She's fine living in a car because she's able to get the shower that she needs and has access to food and those kinds of things. But she's concerned about the other seniors living in their cars or sleeping on benches that she sees. And how are we going to address that need? So there is, you know, there's percolating to the top is how are we going to do programming? And the programming that we're currently doing for those who are 65 and older, it's different, and it's different in the shelter. It's different in how we address those issues. So, I mean, we've got to continue to do what we do best in Petaluma, look to the future and figure out how we're going to address those needs.
I think in the 2020 point in time count, they mentioned that there were 20,000 people that were precariously housed. So whether that means, you know, doubling up with a friend, sleeping on the couch or whatever. So I think to Elise's point, prevention becomes critical so they don't end up on the streets. I just want to make sure I said that.
Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
Sure. Thank you, sir. I would say that in my experience and what we're seeing is clearly the county has been through some traumatic events the last few years that are impacting these things. The recession hasn't helped, COVID hasn't helped. And so where early on in my career, we saw individuals that kind of independently were navigating these issues and getting connected to resources, but the overlap of individuals experiencing multiple of these issues and the level of people that are probably in these precarious positions, like Chuck was pointing out, seems to have grown, right? And so I think that we're just seeing a broader swath of people that are experiencing some of these challenges that we historically may not have seen, and they may not be, you know, in crisis completely yet, but they definitely need help. And so, you know, I think that we've done a better job of looking at that. And then I know what my staff was experiencing as we were dealing with some of these issues in the midst of the pandemic is like Elece pointed out, there was a lot of people that are in their 60s that are shelterless out there. And it's, you know, navigating a winter, navigating a pandemic, those are not good places to be. And so that was a surprising kind of statistic that we started to experience and recognize a little bit more than we had historically seen.
Right. I think a lot of the public looks at the homelessness situation as a shelter issue, and it's so not that. It's so much more than that. I mean, the upstream investments to prevention are super key. They get less attention than someone who's in a tent, you know, but it's just a critical piece. We see right now, statistics are that over 50% of our homeless population have been unsheltered for more than a year, and 25% are less than a month. So basically what that means is if someone is helped at the prevention stage, right at that tipping point, they don't fall into 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. But once they're in a year, it's very difficult to recover the person to housing at that point.
We definitely, as we're talking about this, and part of our discussion yesterday in one of our meetings with Elece and our team was what are the measurable outcomes? And I think that, you know, we are continuing to have a lot of discussions, and when we're building these programs, talking about what a steering committee will be looking at, and how are we assessing the data, and how when we are providing resources and outreach, are we even looking and collecting things on the front end? Because I do look back at some of the programs we've had, and I think there's gaps in what information we have to really understand what we've done. And so I think as a community, we've done a really good job, but we don't necessarily have the data to point back to what some of the success stories have been or how it's really evolved. But with the Sober Circle team that Elece has pointed out, we've been able to develop statistical information and financial information showing the direct correlation to one success and how it lessens the impacts on public safety or the emergency departments or the healthcare districts. And so I think we're doing a much better job at identifying what our outcomes we want to be and how do we measure those and track the progress and the success of these programs.
You know, we mentioned a pathway for people who are unhoused to get to housing. And there's so many steps along the way. The first is being the outreach and connecting, and the second being shelter and services, and then the permanent supportive housing. We have to recognize that all these areas need to be stood up. And recently, the federal government's issued another 300 Section 8 vouchers for Sonoma County. And these are great ways to keep people in houses or put people in houses. But we have to find housing that accepts Section 8 vouchers. And so that's a real call to our public if you have a house and you care about homelessness, consider working with BPSC, I'm assuming, or others who can get people. Without the idea that there's housing at the end of the tunnel, I'm kind of Chuck Slane here, but without that idea that there's housing at the end of the tunnel, it's hard to keep morale up in the shelter process or in your recovery programs. You need to know that there's housing at the end of the tunnel. So if people want to help, they can support permanent housing development permanent supported housing development in Petaluma. That's how we'll get ahead, is to have all parts of the program, have the services, and have those end housing units too.
I think I would be remiss in probably not bringing it up, and it may shift the conversation, so I apologize in advance. But, I think philosophy is important too, that when we really talk about educating the community on what we do and how we do it and why we do it, that's important to touch on. And specific to the police department, there's a lot of differences in approach on how organizations are dealing with these issues, how law enforcement's dealing with these issues, and how we deal with them here locally. And so we've touched on and talked a lot about the services and the outreach and the program, but I think it's important to note, because there is a lot of community confusion on how we as the police department respond and work and address these things when there may be a law violation or a code issue or something like that. And so we, as you've probably heard and everyone's spoken to, the collaboration, the outreach, that's our model. First and foremost, we're an outreach first and enforcement last. And so while we unfortunately have to address issues and sometimes they do result in enforcement, that is far less frequent than the coordination and going out with DST or going out with Randy from COTS and Robin and these meetings and the follow-up. 9 times out of 10, we're successful through our outreach, and we just literally are assisting our partners and making sure there's not safety concerns, and the outreach is successful and alleviates any needs for enforcement, which is great. It gets people the help they need to, and avoids those issues and altercations, and we're glad that we can just be the peacekeepers and the guardians of the community rather than having to be an enforcement branch on things that have alternatives to resolution. So that's clearly not necessarily the way other jurisdictions operate, and there is some models that are heavy based in enforcement, but that's just not the community policing approach that we adhere to here, and nor our philosophy. And that's why I think that philosophy from a policing, a government, and a organizational standpoint is what makes all these things kind of come together with this hub of service and be successful as well.
I think the important thing to remember listening to Brian is we're all on the same side. We all want the same thing. And that's really to care for the unsheltered and to get them in the best situation possible. We look at things a little differently, whether it's from program perspective, law enforcement perspective, a city council and a governance perspective. But at the end of the day, we all are on the same team and we all want the same thing. Yeah.
On that note, why is it that some people choose not to have access to the services available to them, and is that a significant portion of the problem of why unsheltered people remain unsheltered?
Chuck, that's probably more teed for you, but I'll start. And I think our experiences is people are resistant to change, right? And unfortunately, for some of the clients in these situations, they've been accustomed to the environment and the conditions that they're in, and they either don't see the path forward or it requires some compromise, right? It may require some treatment. It may require some compromise in what they're accustomed to in their living situation. And I think there's a lot of freedom with some of the choices that they have made, and going into a shelter environment, there's some hesitation there. There's some unknowns, but we also encounter, unfortunately, there's some people that just don't want to accept those services. And so I think, like Kevin mentioned, Early intervention's key. Those people that haven't necessarily really acclimated to an alternative lifestyle and may be willing to come back in to accept those resources and get help before it's really something that they've been dealing with for a long time. But you know, opportunity and timing seems to be, from my staff's perspective, paramount. Catching someone on the right day where they are wanting the help, they're willing to accept it, and then we try to be as nimble and flexible on seizing that opportunity and calling Randy or Robin or calling Elece or calling whoever we can to get those resources there and get the cavalry to help and start that process as quickly as possible. So that's a little bit, but maybe Randy's got some more, or Chuck, sorry, has more insight on what they're seeing from the shelter perspective.
Yeah, I could build on what Brian had just mentioned. I think a couple things. One is there's a fear of the unknown in a shelter. And so what I mean by that is we're all creatures of habit. Living on the streets, there's a bit of a known risk, and we have some control of what our day looks like. If you will, we're comfortable in uncomfortable situations living on the streets. Not so much when you're in a shelter. It's a little bit unknown. You don't know who the other people are to an extent. And there's rules and regulations that you have to follow because you're living in a congregate setting. And that might be difficult for some people. I think one other reason is a lot of the people on the streets suffer from mental health issues, whether it's PTSD, schizophrenia, bipolar disease, PTSD, whatever. A result of all of that is fear and paranoia. And so going into a shelter, you can develop that fear and paranoia and can exacerbate that. So for those reasons, a shelter just simply doesn't work for some people. I think when you think of a veteran, for example, being in closed quarters, it's very difficult for vets. If you think of people with pets, they don't want to leave their pets because we can't allow pets in a shelter setting. You want to sleep with your husband or your wife, and we have separate beds for that within a shelter setting. And so I think there's a lot of reasons why a shelter just simply doesn't work for people. And that is absolutely okay. So our responsibility is to come up with other living options for people if a shelter doesn't work. And Kevin, you or Elece may want to jump in on that as well.
So in our bi-weekly call that Chuck and I have a conversation with, we both have come to the point of realization that we need to figure out how to provide additional housing. The number we heard earlier was 300. So if we could stand up some kind of housing that is appropriate for individuals in a way that they want to live, then we wouldn't solve the unhoused problem, but we would be giving additional options to people so that they can live the way they want to live. And I think that's a really important point that we have to take back with us. And as we go out and advocate for different kinds of models and programming is how do we provide to our residents options on how they want to live? And to Chuck's point, not everybody wants to live in a shelter. And how do we get as far upstream to a individual who has been given the ACEs test, which is identifying trauma in their childhood, to get them services as far upstream so that when they actually have an opportunity to go into some kind of housing, they have the mental health training that allows them to be able to thrive in that situation and then not feel shut in and contained and all those things. So it's a big, that unwraps, or as I like to say, that takes us down to this rabbit hole on how do we solve all of the issues about the lack of housing available in our community. Kevin, I'll turn that one over to you. Fix it.
Right. Well, thanks. There's tons of good stuff going on and tons of need for it, obviously. So, you know, it's not quite a match, and it's got a lot of work to go. But in an awful lot of the um, homelessness services world, there's a definition that homelessness is a one-time, short duration event, and that's very aspirational, and it relies on intervention so that it don't fall into this condition, and also solutions at the end. There's an awful lot of difference between managing and solving in the homelessness world. I mean, it's a challenge because I think to an extent the public is significantly engaged now because they see things, and I think that the problem is bigger than what they see, and the solution, they have to support, the public has to engage on more levels than just what they're seeing. So housing and affordability is going to be a real crisis in Petaluma. I think the lowercase a affordability, that is the market rate housing, is going to keep drifting away from people's ability to buy. And so our middle class is getting squeezed. But we will always have a need for community housing, which is a capital A affordability, and we need to invest more in that. And the federal government, the state government is pushing out all kinds of programs now, and we have to be nimble and get that funding for our people in Petaluma. And I want to credit staff for great efforts in engaging in these things, being leaders in this. But and also our healthcare providers are bringing in significant programs. St. Joe's, Kaiser, they get a lot of credit for the investments they're making in the supportive services issues, and I'll let Elise or Chuck speak more to that. But we have many partners all trying to get the right thing done. I think it's a real challenge for middle class, but I'm hopeful that between Project Home Key, which is buying properties, either a hotel or apartment or other things that is state funded, and the services necessary to put people in there who need permanent supportive services, hopefully we make ground on that front.
So to Kevin's point, and prevention and intervention, you know, we just went through probably, you know, that act of God, COVID kind of thing that most of us never ever expected. And what we found and what we're seeing, because we're running the county's rental assistance or emergency rental assistance, and we're running the city's rental assistance program, is we've now probably reached a funding point of over $3 million through all the different funding programs to help people stay in their housing, which is great. There's more to spend, and there's more to provide assistance for. But there is this middle class that have never really learned to navigate the system, that have never really learned to ask for help. And I think what we're going to see in this next phase is that middle class, they're going to lose their ability to pay their utility bills. And so then their power is going to get turned off, and then their children are going to start to fail in school. And if I can have our community walk away with one thing, is that there are programs and assistance to actually keep you in your housing, and please take advantage of them. And don't assume that because a year and a half ago you were making a living wage in Petaluma, and then because of COVID you have dropped below that living wage, that you won't qualify for those programs. Never ever assume that. You know, we have this huge outreach program that says it's okay to ask for help, and we want people to ask for help, and we will help you through that process. So at risk of losing your home and falling into this cycle of homelessness, is some of it is preventable because there are resources available. And I think it's important for everybody to recognize that it's okay to ask for help.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so important because, like Elise says, housing is health, housing is education. All those things that may trap you generationally can be addressed right now if you ask for help.
And where do people go to ask for help? People that need it.
Well, they can start at Petaluma People Services Center, but they can ask anybody. If they ask one of the patrol out there from Petaluma PD, if they stop them and say, I need help, they have little cards that say, call PPSC. Somebody at PPSC will help you navigate that system, or talk to your healthcare provider. Because again, to Kevin's point, housing is health. Talk to your educator. If you're falling behind and you don't know where to go, talk to your teacher. Your teacher is going to be able to make some referrals into additional support that's available, so that you don't fall into, as Kevin's point, this generational need, but also you don't fall into a system that it costs us more to dig you out of. Let's keep you in your housing. Let's get you the mental health services. Let's find access to food before you fall into that cycle of homelessness, where it costs us so much more to help bring you out of that system and get you back into housing.
I think one other person to talk with is your doctor.
Yeah.
I mean, we have a good relationship. PPSC, the police department, COTS has a good relationship with the Petaluma Health Center and the Petaluma Valley Hospital. So if you have any questions, talk to your physician.
Yeah, I always say if I had $1 from every Kaiser case manager who called PPSC, I probably wouldn't have to ask my community for additional dollars. So there are those things that you don't think your doctor's going to know, but they do know. And they're building more and more systems to make direct referrals. So you don't even have to pick up the phone. Your physician can actually make a referral directly to PPSC for whatever services that you need. And I'm sure at some point they're going to be able to make that referral directly into kind of a coordinated intake system, so that you can get access to the kind of housing that you need as an individual or as a family.
Are there, and we have about 5 minutes left, maybe 7 minutes left in the time that we've allotted for this conversation. Are there things that individuals in the community who are listening to this conversation and would like to help somehow, individuals could do, or the community at large could do to help with this, with the unsheltered?
Well, for me, I go to housing right away. I mean, if you can support that these folks need a place in our community, and you can be positive about either a group home that's around, and help understand that that's what's needed for folks is housing, whether it's a larger apartment that is going to be proposed in a block away from you. And rather than have the NIMBY, I'm not in my backyard attitude, but yes, I'm helping with solving homelessness. Whether it's an apartment or a residential house that has 4 or 5 people in it, or whether it's vouchers, if we can help with the housing, we can help move people through our system back into permanent housing.
Yeah, I would suggest we have a district policing model, much like what Elece and Chuck were saying, is the early intervention piece. And maybe, people don't know where to go or what to do or whatnot. The intention behind that whole program is basically we've taken the city into 15 smaller neighborhood-sized areas and designated 2 officers to be a conduit for the city, to be a conduit for these resources. So we have that information on our website. You can call, just ask to talk with the district officer, and they can help navigate. Or, it's not uncommon where we email Chuck or we email Elece and we're like, hey, I have this situation. We have no idea what to do. How can you help? And these work groups are great in problem solving and coming up with creative solutions to help these individuals. And so a lot of issues in the community seem to present once they become a problem or become a nuisance or become an aggravation for somebody. And these are those tools to basically maybe early identify or be an early warning for a person in crisis or needing assistance. And so feel free to reach out to my staff and we can connect them, and they can help navigate, the complicated communication systems of government and our resources here, and connect people directly with the services and the people that can make impacts in our community.
Petaluma is very lucky to have the team they have put together between the services, the police, all of this. And the challenge is there's still a big problem, even though we have a good team. So we're finding ways to invest more. I mean, it is being raising to the top of everyone's agenda. And so hopefully with more resources brought to this and having a good team to help with this, we'll be able to improve the situation.
I think one other thing, Lou, is, as we've talked about today, homelessness is complicated. There's just a lot of different issues happening. I think what the community can do is to inform themselves, to try to understand homelessness a little bit better. Kevin and I were talking months ago about, could we do, and he mentioned this earlier, could we do some homelessness 101 in the community where we can inform, educate, raise awareness around homelessness? And we still want to do that, and we want to do that this year. And so I think from a community perspective is really help to educate and inform themselves on homelessness. That'll help tremendously. Maybe you could understand or maybe understand some of the myths that you were having around homelessness. And I think that would help us as providers, as Brian and Elise and as Kevin, try to resolve these issues. And I agree with housing. Housing is the solution to homelessness. Elise?
So I'm gonna, the one last thing I want to share is that if our community has models that have worked in other communities or they have great ideas, I always say the best ideas I've ever had are ideas that I've stole from someplace else and implemented them with a Petaluma twist. So if you have ideas and you have thoughts, don't be worried about sending an email or reaching out to any of us and saying, what about this as a solution? Because we do talk on a regular basis. And if there is a solution that could rise to the top, that's not just Petaluma, but even regionally, that will help address this ongoing issue, then we want to hear it, because oftentimes we do get in our silo. We are only thinking about how to solve this one issue when really there's some bigger solutions that are out there. And could we come together and implement those? So if you really want to understand homelessness, you've got to get into the weeds and really understand how systems work and how we as a community can come together and solve those issues.
Okay, thank you everyone for participating in this. Any last thoughts before we stop?
Well, it's just that it's essential that we do this work. There's a whole human tragedy out there. And I think, it cuts into our souls as not that group to allow that to continue. I mean, it's like a moral imperative that we continue to press on this issue. And thanks to PCRC for hosting.
Thank you, Lou, for hosting.
Okay, thanks everyone.